Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I'm making this video because, as my previous video stated, Farhan Qureshi asked me to watch 4 videos and to comment on. He wanted to hear my thoughts on the content of these 4 videos. In my previous video, I responded to 1 out of the 4. In this video, I'm going to respond to 2 additional videos out of the 4. I still have not finished the 4th video in question. The 2 videos I'll be responding to and giving Farhan my thoughts. One was a debate that he posted on Vimeo, which was a debate between him and Tony Costa regarding who is Jesus. And then I'll be responding to Prof. MTH's video regarding are believers agnostics, essentially. This was a question that Farhan and I were going back and forth about Gnosticism, agnosticism, theism, and so he threw in Prof's video into the mix to see if that could potentially add to the conversation. Now, Farhan, I want to start with your debate with Tony Costa, but the video ended up working, so I did watch it. And I'm not sure if you wanted me to discuss my views on Jesus like before or after watching this video, or whether your video affected my views of Jesus, because Jesus was brought up, and you mentioned your beliefs regarding Jesus and in beings in general in about 2 videos ago of yours. So I don't know if I want to spend a lot of time discussing what I think about Jesus. If we want to discuss Jesus, perhaps that's something we can do in a future video. For now, because I want to try and shove these 2 topics into one video, I'll stick with my initial reactions to your debate, and I'll leave my actual comments regarding what I think about Jesus and whether your video had any effect on my view of Jesus for another video, if you're interested in doing that. With regards to your debate, I must say that your debate was really original. First off, I think you brought more to the discussion than Tony Costa did. Tony really wanted to focus on the historicity of Jesus, to try to discuss who Jesus was. You brought in a complete metaphysical, philosophical smorgasbord, which I don't think Tony was prepared for at all whatsoever. In fact, I think in the debate he said something like, I had no idea that you were going to... Or he said something to the effect of, I didn't know Farhan was going to bring in all the metaphysics. And you really took to task the doctrines that Christians take for granted with regards to, or excuse me, maybe not for take for granted, but try to explain who Jesus was. If I can summarize your point quite clearly, you basically said that if Jesus is God incarnate, then he's a rather diluted God. I believe you used that phrase. What you meant by that was that you only have the second person of the Trinity that incarnated. According to Paul, he gave up most of his supernatural faculties and incarnated as a man, a finite being. And thus, what a diluted deity we have as an image. Now, you then go on to say that wouldn't it be better if, instead of focusing on God's essence manifested in this world, or in the Christian case, incarnated in this world, wouldn't it just be better, instead of worshiping or focusing on those moments in time, such as the burning bush, or instances such as that, then instead we should look past that and see the God that's behind all of those instances. Very fascinating indeed, and I think this is something that Christians definitely should mull over. I wasn't able to watch the whole debate, so I don't know if you actually managed to get Tony to, concede to very much, or to end up agreeing with you, as I know that he really wanted to focus on the historicity. I know he responded to some of your interpretations of Christian doctrine, but he really didn't seem to want to go with you to that point of common ground, where we could discuss a God that we all could agree upon, regardless of its manifestations, incarnations, etc., etc. Basically, its physical relationship, if any, with our reality. So I hope I haven't diluted your argument, but in a nutshell, I think you did a great job, and I think that your points are something that have never really been discussed in most debates regarding the identity of Jesus. I think a combination of your video with Bar Ehrman's newest book, Did Jesus Exist?, should certainly be considered, all points should be considered, when discussing at least a Christian perspective on who Jesus was, or is, if you will. So again, I will leave off my personal views about Jesus for another time, and I hope, Farhan, that these statements about your debate was something you were looking for. With regards to the video by Prof. MTH, again, another great video. I certainly think, Farhan, that you chose this video very well with regards to you and I discussing, are believers agnostics, or are we all agnostic, in that regard. I think Prof did a great job of setting up the question of what is God, and can anyone really answer that question? As he pointed out, and I've read Sales' book, Atheism, The Case Against God, back when I took philosophy of religion, about year or so ago, and we as believers are able to discuss attributes that he terms as relational or secondary. But with regards to actually defining what is God as a being, for an example, he points out that most believers just say, well, we don't know. God's beyond our comprehension. We only know so much as what is revealed in the Scriptures. That is the chip off the iceberg that we are able to comprehend. This, of course, does not go into the discussion of intuitive reasonings for God, or the mystical experiences that you and I discuss, where someone has a spiritual experience and that just does it for them. They may not be able to define the being that they experience, but they are, or who maybe sent the spiritual experience, or whatever modus operandi the experience occurred, but that is something that it makes them convinced of the spiritual qualities of the experience. Now, I would have to join the rest of people by saying that yes, talking about in a metaphysical context, or even talking about a rational way of describing God, what God is as a being, I think escapes most people. Now, most people who believe in God will probably use analogies like, well, that's like asking an ant to describe us as humans. These are very old cliches. And I think the flaw with this is, frankly, that yes, God is beyond our comprehension. So to ask someone rationally, and Prof mentions this, that theism falls out of reason, I think you're looking for an explanation of God in the wrong place. Sure, it may seem illogical or irrational, if you will, because obviously if theism falls out of favor with reason, therefore it falls out with rationale, therefore it is irrational. However, if I were to take the stance of Carl Gustav Jung and say that essentially God can only be understood to the best of our ability psychologically, and that when we discuss God, we are really only discussing God as far as our own minds can comprehend, or the images can comprehend. So therefore, we are really only discussing God imaginally. And this is something that Ibn Arabi, and I have started to read the works of Ibn Arabi and books about Ibn Arabi, that he believed in imaginal concepts. So in other words, each individual believer in his own mind has a unique understanding of God. And that is about as far as that person can comprehend. Therefore, while I may not be able to give a concrete, factual concept of what God is by saying, oh yes, I totally understand what God's being is, subjectively, God is understood by various people in their own unique ways. And that, in my opinion, and this would be the opinion of Carl Gustav Jung, that is actually equally important. So we may not be able to arrive at an objective view of God. So in other words, we may not be able to all agree upon the being of God. We may not be able to say that we know what constitutes God as a being, but yet the subjective experiences or ideas that people individually have about why they believe in God, what they do believe in God, even if their faith just rests on what Prof said, which was the secondary attributes, most believers that is the core of their relationship, that they understand God to the best of their ability with a limited capacity that was given to them, and everything else is unknowable. Now, having said that, I think the essence of the point that you and Prof are making, that theists have points of agnosticism, or if you will, there are moments when we are not knowing, it's unknowable to us, as Prof quoted many believers as saying. I would be willing to say that, yeah, okay, these are points where people are saying that they don't know. Now, again, talking about the interesting points of labels, I still don't buy labeling everybody as agnostic. Because the difference between classical agnosticism and at least from my understanding when I took philosophy of religion, and then theism, is that classical agnosticism is saying that we don't know anything about God. Absolutely nothing. Not only just the primary nature of God, but even whether these secondary attributes are actually relevant. How do we know? How do we even know God exists? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. These are usually the core concepts of agnosticism. Now, a theist certainly doesn't buy into that, because as Prof himself said in his video, a theist is willing to say, well, look, I believe in these secondary and relationship attributes, I just might not be able to answer the question of the primary attribute. For example, he says, what is X? And then you can just start describing what X is not, you can start describing what X is with regards to attributes. So for God, in the place of X, God is all-merciful, all-compassionate, etc., etc. But I do not think that they would be able to go 100% in the way of agnosticism, at least classically understood. Hence why he brings up the phrase agnostic theism, or agnostic atheism. You brought this up yourself. Even if people were to admit that they were, okay, fine, agnostic theists, they still are a theist, are they not? So therefore, this is why I don't agree that theism just sort of fades away, and now we're just talking about agnosticism. Furthermore, if I were to again use the arguments of Carl Gustav Jung from an analytical psychological point of view, again, if I know myself, I know God. So in other words, the self is the archetypal, almost dual image of the God archetype, as I've mentioned in past videos. Now, Jung himself said, in many quotations, that we can only really talk about the God image, archetypally speaking. This is something that is very much unconscious, but we have conscious opinions about what this is. So therefore, if this is the case, then knowing myself, I come to know God. Now this is again individual, this ties into what Ibn Arabi discussed, but again, this is something that when asked, Jung said, I don't believe, I know. Because he knew himself. Therefore, by knowing himself, he knew his own soul, and he knew God. So I think that this is something that should be considered. When we are talking about metaphysical truths, this is where we get into all of the debates and discussions about, well, do we know these metaphysical truths are true? Do we know that they are false? Does this prove God? To understand God as a being. And I think that metaphysically, philosophically, these are important discussions to have. But I think for people to understand God from a personal perspective, and again, this would be the theistic point of view, what is more personal than understanding your own soul via your psyche, or even synonymously, your psyche is your soul? If you understand yourself, then this quote, know yourself and you know God, which has been postulated by mystics around the world, scholars from almost every tradition, then can we not say that we know God? And thus, if I know God via knowing myself, am I an agnostic? That would be the question I would have to ask you. So as I said, Jung was very clear that when it comes to metaphysical points, where we're trying to understand something objectively, we fall into the sort of pattern that Prof so eloquently put. Yet, subjectively speaking, I can say that I know God, and thus I cease being an agnostic with regards to my subjective understanding of God. Because everyone's individual experience, everyone's individual idea of what God is going to vary. Because we are not all the same. And this is right in line with what I understand Ibn Arabi's point of imaginal world to be. This is what I understand Jung saying, and maybe in the future I will make videos when I have learned more about Ibn Arabi's views, and maybe I'll make a video devoted to just sort of talking about quotes that Jung said about God. But for anyone interested, Jung's book Psychological Reflections, I've mentioned this book before, has a number of quotations from his various works. And he mentions in several places what he means by God as a metaphysical concept, and also as an archetype. And again, if you're confused about this, please look up what I mean by archetype or God image, etc., and look at my past videos. But this is where I stand. I do think Prof's video was an excellent execution. I think it should raise a lot of discussion. I think we should be humbled by what we know and what we don't know. But again, I'm not willing to say that theists will go completely with classic agnosticism. And maybe that wasn't his point. but I think that we need to be able to define each other in a way that makes sense to ourselves and to others in a relationship context. So I hope I wasn't just beating around the bush. I may need to make subsequent videos to clarify my points, but these were my thoughts, my reactions initially to watching both videos. So Farhan, I look forward to your response. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.